The Galactic Research Station Khelar-9 was not a prison, at least not officially. It existed for science, so it was recorded in the Species Council's protocols. Here, they studied the limits of biology, endurance, adaptation, and the response of sentient beings to extreme conditions. No torture, no cruelty, only experiments and results. Dr. Serral reviewed the data on the transparent screen. Subject 12, collapse in 43 minutes, the assistant reported calmly. As expected, Serral replied, tapping the panel with his long fingers. The Terrian species depends on a stable ambient temperature. The screen changed. Subject 13 surrendered after 18 minutes of sensory isolation. Subject 14, 2 hours without gravitational balance. Subject 15, 6 hours without fluids. All results fit the model, always until today. A new file opened automatically. Subject 17, species, human origin, third planet of the yellow star. Local name, Earth. Status, military personnel. Serral tilted his head. Humans? Are these the new primates? Yes, replied the assistant, recently added to the contact list. Physically average in every respect. Serral nodded. Average species usually broke down the fastest. The surveillance camera activated. A man sat in the center of the white room. His hands were restrained by energy bands. No weapons, no aggression. He was simply sitting. Dark hair, an exhausted face, his gaze fixed on the floor. How long has the dehydration test been going on? Serral asked. The assistant checked the data. He paused. He checked again. 72 standard hours. Serral froze. Impossible. The data has been verified 3 times. Most species lost cognitive function after just 20 hours. After 40, they began to beg. After 50, they panicked. This one remained silent. The man raised his head. No screams, no fear. He simply looked straight into the camera and smiled, barely noticeable. The assistant shuddered. He understands he's being watched. Everyone understands, Serral replied dryly. No, the assistant said quietly. The others look with hope or fear. He paused. But this one looks as if he's evaluating us. Serral activated the audio channel. Subject 17, a translated voice sounded in the chamber. You may end the test at any time. Simply utter the surrender phrase. The man was silent. A few seconds. Then he replied in a hoarse voice, Will there be water? The assistant nodded quickly. Yes. The man thought for a moment and shook his head. Then it's too soon. He leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes, as if the conversation were over. The lab fell silent. He refused? The assistant whispered. Serral slowly zoomed in on the man's face. Elevated heart rate, body under stress. Signs of exhaustion are evident, and yet stable. We're continuing the test, said the scientist, but for the first time in his entire career, he felt something unfamiliar. Not curiosity, not fascination, doubt. 6 hours later, Subject 17 was still conscious. 12 hours later, he began to hum something indistinct under his breath. After 20 hours, he smiled again, and it was then that Serral thought for the first time, what if the limit of this species' endurance isn't where we're looking for it at all? The screen refreshed. Experiment status. Ongoing expected breakdown time unknown. The system had never displayed that word before. Never. The Khelar-9 research station orbited a dim blue star, far from trade routes and even farther from any compassion. It was built precisely for this purpose. No one here asked moral questions, only scientific ones. Day 4 of the experiment. The main laboratory operated non-stop. 3 levels of observation platforms hovered above the central test module. Transparent screens overlapped one another, displaying biometrics, neural activity, and body temperature maps. In the center, Subject 17, a human. He was no longer sitting upright. His shoulders had slumped. His movements had slowed. His lips were parched. Each breath was deeper than the last, but he remained conscious. "Explain it again," said Siral, without taking his eyes off the readings. "How much fluid has he received?" "0," replied the technician. "Complete absence since the start of the test." It's impossible to sustain cognitive function for that long. The assistant hesitated. Perhaps their species evolved in an unstable environment? Siral said nothing. He had already read the human dossier, a planet with predators, an erratic climate, constant competition even within their own species. But no evolution explained this. "Parameter change. Begin phase 2, he ordered. The chamber floor glowed faintly. Gravity increased by 40%. For most species, this caused panic almost instantly. The body felt foreign, heavy, uncontrollable. The man slowly opened his eyes. His arms tensed in the restraints. His muscles trembled. He tried to sit up straighter and froze, breathing heavily. Warnings flashed on the screen. Cardiovascular system overload. The assistant shifted nervously. "He's going to break down now." 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The man closed his eyes and began to breathe evenly, slowly, rhythmically. Inhale, pause, exhale, inhale. Heart rate stabilized. Silence fell over the lab. "Is he regulating his own reactions?" the technician whispered. Siral increased neural activity. The man's brain exhibited a pattern similar to a meditative state. Conscious suppression of panic. "Do they train for this?" he asked quietly. "Military records mention psychological preparation for captivity." Siral felt a chill run down his spine, the look of someone preparing to be captured. Hour 96. Subject 17 suddenly spoke, on his own, without addressing anyone. "You've already changed the gravity 3 times, he said hoarsely. "Do you think I don't notice?" The assistant flinched. "He's analyzing the experiment." Siral switched on the audio channel. "What exactly do you notice?" The man slowly turned his head toward the camera. His eyes were tired but clear. "You're looking for the moment when I'll ask to stop." Pause. "But the problem is, I'm waiting too." "Waiting for what?" A barely perceptible smile. "For when you start to get nervous." No one in the lab laughed, because it had already happened. Day 5, new researchers began to avoid Sector 7. The recordings showed a strange trend. The staff looked at the camera longer than the job required, as if they were checking to see if he was still there. And every time the man either looked back or seemed to know he was being watched. "It's a psychological effect," Siral said to himself. "We're projecting meaning." But even he began to notice the details. The person wasn't wasting energy, didn't struggle against the restraints, didn't scream. He was conserving his strength, as if he knew the experiment would be long, as if he'd been through something like this before. Hour 120. The system issued a new warning. Forecasting model failed subject's behavior outside parameters. Siral reread the line twice. The station's algorithms were based on data from 11,000 species. They had never been this wrong before. The assistant said quietly, "Doctor, The other subjects have asked to end the test to stop the suffering. He swallowed. And this one is holding on as if it were a competition. Sorrel looked at the man. He sat motionless, eyes closed. His breathing was steady. And for the first time, the scientist realized a terrifying thought. Perhaps we no longer control the experiment. A new status appeared on the screen: psychological impact of the subject on staff. Recorded Sorrel turned off the notification, but the feeling remained. They were no longer studying the man. The man was slowly studying them. On the 5th day, the experiment ceased to be a routine study. On the 6th, it became a problem. On the 7th, no one dared call it science out loud anymore. The sector council's decision, "We've reached a dead end," said senior analyst Catan, projecting the data onto the table. The holograms flickered: heart rate, neural activity, hormonal responses. All the graphs looked like errors, but there was no error. "Physical stress doesn't work," he continued. "Dehydration doesn't work. Gravitational pressure doesn't work." Sorrel was silent. He knew what would come next. Moving on to cognitive breakdown. The room grew quieter. Even among researchers, this method was considered extreme. Not painful. Worse. Phase 3. Loss of time. The lights in the chamber went out. Completely. Not darkness. An absolute absence of reference points. The walls stopped reflecting sound. Air currents leveled off to a perfect zero. The temperature stabilized to neutral. No changes. No signals. No way to tell how much time had passed. For most sentient beings, it was unbearable. The brain began to create its own reality after just a few hours. The person was left alone, without light, without sound, without time. Hour 6. "He's barely moving," whispered the assistant. The infrared sensor showed only slight changes in posture. "We're expecting disorientation," Sorrel replied. "In how long?" 12 hours at most." Hour 14. Nothing. Heart rate stable. Breathing controlled. Neural activity unusual. "Is he asleep?" the technician asked. Sorrel shook his head. "No, this is a conscious state." "But how? Without time markers?" The scientist didn't answer. 8 p.m. The man suddenly spoke, quietly. At first, the translator couldn't recognize the language. It was too quiet. Then the system adjusted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The assistant leaned closer. "Is he counting?" "Yes." The person counted slowly, evenly, without pauses, second by second. "He's creating his own time," whispered Sorrel. 31 minutes. The counting didn't stop. A perfectly steady rhythm. The algorithm compared the intervals. The margin of error was less than 3%, less than that of the station's automatic metronomes. "That's impossible," said the analyst. "A biological brain can't be that precise." Sorrel looked at the readings, and for the first time he felt genuine concern. The man wasn't just enduring the isolation, he was adapting the environment to himself. Hour 40. The count changed. Now he was saying different words, short phrases. The translator paused, processing the context. "Hold your position. Breathe evenly. Don't rush. You're still here." The assistant slowly turned to Sorrel. "Is he talking to himself?" "No," the scientist replied quietly. "He's keeping himself going." Hour 52. The first glitch didn't happen in the chamber. It happened in the lab. A young technician jerked back from the screen. "He was looking at me." "The camera is off," replied another. "I know, but it's like he knows I'm here." No one laughed, because almost everyone felt the same way. Hour 60. The system issued a warning. Sector 7. Personnel. Elevated stress level. Reason. Unknown. Saral turned off the notification, but his hands were shaking for the first time. He turned the camera's audio back on. Subject 17. You may end the experiment. Silence. A few seconds. Then a voice from the darkness. How long has it been? Saral paused. It doesn't matter. A brief pause. And the reply, it does to you. He exhaled quietly. Not to me. The lab grew cold, though the temperature hadn't changed, because everyone suddenly realized one thing. They had taken his time away from him, and yet he had found a way to have it. The system updated the status. Probability of psychological breakdown of the subject. Undetermined. Probability of psychological breakdown of the staff. Increasing Saral stared at those lines for a long time. And for the first time, he thought, what if we're not testing the limits of a person, but our own? By the 8th day of the experiment, Sector 7 was operating at only half capacity. Not because of malfunctions, because of the staff. Researchers began requesting transfers. Technicians hesitated at the door before entering. Some turned off the audio channel, citing excessive noise. In reality, they simply no longer wanted to hear a human voice. Artificial Intelligence Report, the station's chief AI, ARX Prime, had no emotions. That is precisely why its report forced Saral to reread the lines 3 times. Anomaly in staff behavior. Cause, prolonged observation of Subject 17. Recommendation, reduce contact. This is absurd, said Saral. The subject is isolated. And yet he knew the truth. He was isolated only physically. Camera. The darkness remained complete. Only the sensors allowed him to see the silhouette of a human. He no longer counted aloud. He didn't speak. He barely moved at all. Heart rate low, breathing slow, body energy consumption minimal. He's entering a state of energy conservation, said the biologist. That's impossible without biochemical changes, replied the other. Saral silently increased neural activity and froze. The man's brain was working actively, very actively. He isn't sleeping, the scientist said quietly. Then what is he doing? Saral didn't answer right away. Thinking. Day 9. The audio system suddenly activated on its own. No one had turned it on. A quiet murmur came from the speakers. The translator kicked in with a delay. If you're listening to this, it means you're worried. Everyone in the lab froze. Who opened the channel? Ketan snapped. No one, the technician replied. It was turned off. The voice continued, calm and faint, yet confident. You've stopped changing the conditions, which means you don't know what to do next. Saral felt a chill run down his spine. Is it analyzing our behavior without sensors? Impossible. But there was no explanation, a psychological turning point. Why haven't you surrendered yet? Saral suddenly asked, switching to the direct channel. A few seconds, only silence. Then the reply, because you're expecting it. That's illogical. You're exhausted. A brief pause. I am a soldier. As if that were enough. Saral frowned. That's not an explanation. And then the man said the phrase that changed everything. If I give up, you'll decide that all humans give up. The lab fell completely silent. And I cannot allow you to think that. The first fear, the security system suddenly sounded an alarm. Staff stress. Critical level. 2 researchers left the sector without permission. One turned off his monitor, saying only, "It watches, even when it isn't watching." For the first time, Sirral didn't comment because he caught himself avoiding the screen. An event they could not explain. At the 216th hour of the experiment, the impossible happened. No light, no sound, no external signals. The person suddenly raised their head directly toward the main camera and said, "You're in charge." Sirral froze. "Did he address you?" whispered the assistant. The scientist slowly sat down. "The camera doesn't show the observers' positions." The speakers sounded again. "The one who remains silent the longest is always the leader." Sirral felt his heart racing. He really had barely spoken in the last few days. He observed, he analyzed, and the person understood that without any way of knowing. At that moment, even ARX Prime recorded a new status, unable to determine source of object's behavioral prediction. And for the first time in the station's history, the system added a new parameter, recommendation. Review the status of the experiment. Sirral stared at the dark silhouette in the camera for a long time, and he realized a terrible thing. They were no longer waiting for the human to break. They were waiting to see what he would do next. By the 10th day of the experiment, no one argued anymore. Sector 7 was silent. The monitors were running. Data was being recorded. The station was functioning perfectly. But the atmosphere had changed. Now the researchers spoke in whispers, as if they were afraid of being overheard. "Station Council, we've lost our scientific objectivity," said Catan, looking at the reports. "The staff is showing emotional attachment and fear." "The subject is still functional," replied another researcher. "This is an unprecedented result." "That is precisely why the experiment must be terminated," Sirral said quietly. Everyone turned to him. He spoke calmly, but for the first time without a scientific tone. "We were searching for the limit of endurance." He paused. "But it seems that, for this species, the limit is not physical." No one objected. The chamber, for the first time in many days, the light slowly returned. Soft, subdued. The man squinted. His movements were slow, labored. His body was clearly exhausted, but his eyes remained clear. Sirral switched on the channel. "Subject 17, experiment complete." Silence. The man took a slow breath. "How long?" The scientist answered honestly, 10 standard days." The man smiled faintly. "I thought it would be longer." Several researchers flinched. The energy restraints deactivated. For the first time ever, the man could move freely. He didn't jump up. He didn't rush forward. He just sat there, catching his breath, as if he knew haste is a luxury. The chamber door opened. Sirral entered personally, a violation of dozens of protocols. He stopped at a safe distance. For a few seconds they simply looked at each other, the researcher and the subject. "Why?" Sirral asked. "Your body was close to failure many times. You could have stopped it at any moment." The man was silent. Then he replied quietly, "Do you have a word for when someone gives up sooner than they should?" The translator searched for an equivalent. "Surrender," said Sirral. The man shook his head. "We have another." He took a deep breath. "Just a little more." Realization, Sirral tilted his head. "That's not a logical survival strategy." A slight smile. "It's not a strategy." Pause. "It's a habit." The scientist felt all the pieces of data finally fall into place. Humans weren't the strongest, not the fastest, not the most biologically resilient. But they had something else. They didn't define the limit by the body's capabilities. They shifted it with determination. Final experiment. Log A RX prime recorded the final report. Conclusion. The human species exhibits a unique behavioral trait, voluntary continuation of functioning after reaching the predicted limit of exhaustion. Preliminary name of the phenomenon, unfinished surrender syndrome. Searle changed the wording by hand. He wrote just 2 words, human stubbornness. Before departure, the human was given water. He drank slowly in small sips as if it were a ritual. "Were you afraid?" he asked suddenly. Searle paused to think. A scientist should have objected, but he answered honestly, "Yes." The man nodded. "Good. Why? Because if you started to be afraid, it means you started to understand." 3 cycles later, the station's report was sent to the entire Galactic Council. A recommendation was added as a separate line. In the event of contact with humanity, do not test the limits of their endurance unless absolutely necessary. Reason unknown. Breaking point. In the last camera recording, the man was leaving the station accompanied by security. He walked slowly, still weak, but his back was straight, and as he passed the observation window, Searle suddenly understood the crux of the matter. They hadn't broken the man, and they hadn't even come close, because the real experiment ended the moment the researchers began to ask themselves how long they themselves would have lasted in his place.